Good evening. Welcome to Archival Documentary and Historical Research. I'm glad to be back with Savia as always for our Tuesday sessions. And tonight we're going to talk about, sorry, just give me a second. There we go. Tonight we're going to talk about historical research, and we're going to do it in two different ways. I'm going to start off with a bit of storytelling because my own background, my own introduction to research over the years has actually been through using historical research principles. And it's where I started my research career. It is for me, not only that kind of legacy and that history, but I also think it's a very valid approach, especially when we're looking at master's degree research. For those who might be going on to do a PhD, and I know some of you guys here tonight are PhD candidates, but for those of you, going on to do a PhD, historical research may be a small component of it, or archival research may be a small component of it, but it's unlikely to be a significant amount of the methodology that you use. However, it still has a place and it still has a contribution. So tonight, Savia and I are going to both talk about our own experiences in relation to this, but also to share some best practice advice, to share some ideas on how one goes about conducting historical research. Now, I want to give a bit of a simplistic overview as we start, because I think that's very, very important. Historical research is about, or is effectively, the process of investigating past events systematically to provide an account of happenings in the past. Now, it really gives us this opportunity to go back and to put the lens, or to put the focus, to put the microscope onto things that have happened and to make an analysis, to tell the story of what happened. Now, you might argue that's history. And yeah, we can study World War I and World War II, and we can study Cleopatra and all of that. But every single aspect of our discipline, of our chosen niche area, actually has a history to it. And we can embrace that and use that and work with it. Now, it's not simply the accumulation of dates and facts, or even just a description of the past happenings. Now, that's kind of what I think history is about. Learn and memorize dates and facts and happenings. But it is actually trying to create a flowing and a dynamic explanation. So dynamic explanation or description of past events, which include an interpretation of these, because we want to recapture the implications, the personalities, the ideas that have influenced these events. Now, I'm sort of more historical research in that aspect of the discussion, but it does apply when we're looking at our archival research and so forth as well, because it is bringing back previous materials and being able to make use or interpretation of them. Now, what sets us apart from high school history, and I don't mean to be offensive to anybody who studies history here, but what sets us apart is really trying to put those new lenses and those new explanations over things that have happened. But it's also, we're trying to perhaps investigate and understand non-mainstream happenings as much as we try to investigate and understand well-known public events. Just give me a second. Where's my, there we go. The purpose of historical research is really to verify and explain history of whatever we're talking about. by means of the scientific process. So I've done historical research in a few different areas, and I'll show you some examples shortly, but I'm interested in it particularly for business research. And what we're able to do is go back and explain in hindsight patterns of evolution, patterns of behavior, patterns that have occurred internally in organizations, patterns that have occurred externally in organizations. Now, with this, we're really simply approaching something that has happened a while ago through different resources, because in many cases, we don't have first-hand, immediate or arm's length communication with those who were part of the events. We're relying on documents, we're relying on archives, we're relying on oral histories and other approaches to have recorded previous situations or previous events. The aims for conducting historical research are quite easygoing. We want to reveal or uncover the unknown. Now, this is when we get into our niche. We're actually able to talk about things that previously hasn't been out there or hasn't been necessarily part of an existing research process. We're able, or we hope we are able, if we're a good researcher, we're able to answer questions that are yet to be answered. And what I mean by that is, look, things have happened. We might not have looked at a particular event in history with regards to a particular community. We may not have looked at it and answered questions from a modern perspective, or been able to showcase how things have evolved. So often we are able to answer questions that haven't been addressed through the triangulation of available historical information to help us with that. We can search and identify relationships of the past to the present. And I think this is an important component of what we are trying to do with historical research. We are looking to see what has happened so that we can understand what may happen today and into the future. So some of my early research was on Chinese family businesses in Southeast Asia, in particular Singapore and even Malaysia to some extent with that. Looking at what was happening in the past helps to build a model, helps to build a theory for what we expect family business practices would be into the future. So we're actually not only talking about and analyzing what happened, but we're also setting loose frameworks. I want to say rules, but let's call it loose frameworks as to what we can expect the future to bring in similar scenarios. It also gives us a chance to record and assess achievements that have happened. And the final one, which I feel is extremely vital, is to assist in understanding human culture. And I put it in this way. We live in an era that is very distinctively different to when I grew up. Not only are we having rapid advancements in digital technology, but our social values are changing significantly. Now, not to get into any of the issues that are there, but there are differences. 50 years ago, racism was very normal, accepted. It was institutionalized by governments the world over. Gender disparity and inequality also institutionalized by governments. And even if we look inside organizations, the practices of who could be management, gender, again, is an issue, sociocultural is an issue. it helps us, historical research helps us to understand not only what the events were, but it helps us to put a framework or a lens on it, because 40 years ago, something that was acceptable to society then and isn't now can still be explained. And we need today, we need those explanations to be able to understand it. So when I look at the idea of historical research, it really is helping us understand not only the niche that we are investigating, but it is helping us understand the social context that was acceptable at the time that led to those actions, those decisions, etc. But also, how did we grow from where we were then to where we are today? So I feel that is extremely important. Now I want to give you a bit of a personal introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to Savia. The personal introduction is really to share some of the research that I had played with. And I call it played with because, I was either directly or indirectly involved. I was involved in projects related to it, but all of it has become historical, archival, or documentary. So historical in terms of some time ago, archival in terms of where one gets the resources. I should have said documentary first, because documentary is about the written documents and the accounts and the oral histories and everything that's there. But archival goes a bit broader, because archival includes things like maps, like oral history recordings, video recordings, diaries, all sorts of things. So those became part of how I was able to undertake research and achieve publications. Now, the very first time I ever came across historical research was when I was first in university, a very long time ago. And my lecturer, Honky Yoon, a Korean guy who barely spoke English, lived in New Zealand, and he was doing research on Maori communities. And he wrote the book Maori Mind, Maori Land. And this was the first time I'd looked at a social science resource that was trying to explain the Maori community, so the native people of New Zealand, the Maori community's linkage with their environment and their community building practices. So here was this Korean guy who went around New Zealand to the different Maori communities, to the marae, which is the meeting house where the Maori communities come together as tribes and host individuals. Here was this Korean guy going around New Zealand, and he wrote this book in 1981, so it's quite old too. Well, now I think I'm old. He wrote this book in 81, and it was looking at how things had evolved for the Maori community over the years. So he went around to the different marae, he held focus groups, discussion groups, town halls, all qualitative techniques. But he also spent a lot of time looking at artifacts, listening to stories, and the cultural stories, the oral history that was passed down from generation to generation to generation, actually gave him the content, gave him the information to be able to develop an understanding of the Maori person's attitude and understanding of their environment. And that culminated in his first book. Now, why I put this here is I wasn't involved in that, but that was the first one that opened my mind to the concept of artifacts as part of research and oral histories, verbal communication through the generations. storytelling, folklore, all of this as part of a research data collection opportunity for a researcher to then draw conclusions. This is perhaps one of my most favorite projects. And not that I was alive in 1967, but Warwick was my mentor and my professor for many years. In fact, I'm still connected to him and still manage to talk with him once in a while. In the 1960s, he went to Singapore and he conducted research into the development of Singapore as a society. Now, in the 1960s, it was very exciting because it was not only a time where Singapore had joined Malaysia, it was a time where Singapore also fortunately got kicked out of Malaysia. And there are a lot of dynamics going on, both political, socio-economic, cultural at that time. Now, one of the things that was really fascinating about Warwick's thesis was he was dealing with a significant amount of loose historical data. So at one stage, one chapter, there's 28 chapters from memory. One chapter was looking at the historical evolution of the population of Singapore. And he had got population records from multiple sources. And I'm talking 10 to 12 different sources, not only the government Department of Statistics, because some of his sources predated the Singapore government even having a statistics department. And some of these data were either incomplete or in conflict. And he had to use elements of triangulation in order to not only bring the data together, but to align the data into similar categories. So, for example, in some of the historic documents which were available, the Chinese community was referred to only as Chinese. In others, it would break it up into different cultural groups, sub-ethnicities associated with mainland China immigrants who had traveled or moved into Singapore. Then there were gaps, and these gaps left questions, and it required looking at other sources to try and say, can I use other sources to fill this gap? And what he did is he took all of these data sources, he structured them in a way where he could make credible claims with proof, credible claims as to what the historical population data in Singapore was from the 1800s through to 1967. Now, why does this have an appeal to me? Because I'm working on bringing this, I believe, I say a very important book. I'm working on bringing this book into the 2020s by looking at how the evolution of society, the change that has happened over the years, has actually evolved from 1967 through to current period of time. So I also get to look at all of his data, and I get to look at more modern data, but still over a period of 50-something years, 55 years. I still get to look at that, and I still get to use that as the data sets that help inform my update of this particular book. Now, this is some research that I personally did. This is actually out of my master's thesis, which was looking at a case study of a Chinese conglomerate in Singapore and how it had grown and developed, and the interconnected ties it had not only with Malaysia, but also regionally. And all of these are actually newspaper articles. A significant chunk of my mapping out the history and the interlinkages of this particular business, to be able to see whether it conformed to predetermined models of Chinese family business behavior, or whether it created something differently, was actually based on newspaper articles. I spent an entire week in the university library at National University of Singapore. They have, or they had, I don't know if it still exists, but they had in the 90s a huge room which was full of newspaper clippings, and the librarians would every day go through every newspaper in Singapore and clip out clippings related to different topics. So there'd be business, there'd be social, etc., and they'd put them in bound volumes, and they'd update these every day. So when I was looking for this company, when I was looking for certain concepts, when I was looking to do with government policy and so forth, I'm going in, I'm looking at these bound volumes of newspaper clippings, I'm photocopying them at 20 cents a page, so it cost me a fortune. But I'm using these historical newspaper articles to be able to help me as the data set to be able to map out what has happened, what is happening in terms of the business. And I actually went back to the 1940s, I believe. These ones are all 80s and 90s, but I just chose a random page out of my thesis. But I was able to go through a humongous amount. And to be fair, I brought back to New Zealand with me a pile of photocopied stuff that was close to a foot high, probably 4 reams of paper at least, which was photocopied newspaper articles, which I then had to read through every single one to see what the information in there was, and then to map that out in terms of corporate development for the company. Now, along with that, I was fortunate enough to be able to utilize oral history records. The National Archives of Singapore had just undertaken, a few years before my research, they had undertaken an oral history project where they interviewed a significant number of successful local entrepreneurs to understand what had happened. The government had recognized that if they don't talk to these people before they die, they're going to lose their stories. And the government felt it was valuable enough for them to actually coordinate interviews. These tapes were made available, which was absolutely fantastic. Now, you can see there's 2 books there. The one on the right is my very thrilling master's thesis. The one on the left is a book that came out in the very early 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. I think 91, 92, I might be wrong. Stepping Out: The Making of Chinese Entrepreneurs. And this entire book was based on an analysis and a development from the oral history records. Now, the oral history records posed a problem for me. First of all, I had to go to the National Archives. Not an issue. Anybody could go in, researchers could go in, they would help you. Every single interview that I wanted was in Chinese. And just to make that more annoying, it was typeface, so typewritten in Chinese. My Chinese at the time was slightly better than now, but still really crap. So I had to sit with one of the librarians at the archive who stepped me through and summarized the general discussion, the general record of the archive, of the oral history recording, so that I could identify, did I need a copy of that page? And she spent a few hours with me just going through and explaining the different things, and then helping me make copies of the areas that I wanted, so that later when I got back to New Zealand, I could have them translated. Now, this was kind of an eye-opener to me, because not only was I using very much secondhand material, I was using an oral history archive that was designed for a specific purpose, but I was trying to get rich insights out of it, but I was doing it in a language that was not mine. And what I mean from here is, look, there's some fantastic archives out there. I naively went into the oral history department and the National Archives thinking, of course it'll be in English, not thinking about the fact that I was going to have that roadblock. Now, there are lots of archival resources out there, and I fully encourage their use, but recognize that not everything will conform to your expectations. Sometimes, like this, you're going to have to call in favors, you're going to have to get translations, you're going to be working with things that take you outside of your comfort zone. Now, from both the newspapers and the oral history archives and the data that was in there, I was able to start to map out, and this is just a page where I mapped out over a 20-year period, different joint ventures, different interrelationships between the parent company in Malaysia, the parent company in Singapore, and other businesses that they had a familial or family relationship with. So all of these, and I'm talking about my 4 reams of photocopying, all of these resulted in effectively, I think I did a 2 or a 3-page diagram that summarized some of the key relationships and how it happened. What's embarrassing about this is I even see spelling mistakes to this day that I should have better proofread back then. Further into my career, I got involved in globalization because my interests had developed. And one of the academics I was working with, Gordon Winder from Auckland, he wanted to have a look at how the movie industry had globalized over the period 1955, 1975, 1995. And we were looking at the fact that transportation, it was so easy in 1995 to hop on a plane and go somewhere. So movies in the 90s became more localized. But in the 50s and even in the 70s, where mass transportation internationally was not accessible to the masses, the movie industry brought the world to us. So we actually had a globalization, and to some extent, as time has gone on, we've had a de-globalization of movies, because in the 50s, the exotic locations where movies were filmed, not only what you saw in the movie itself, but how it was sold, the advertisements, for example, what you see here, were significantly more globalized in the 50s. And that sort of wilted away a little bit. And by the time we got to the 90s, we were seeing more very boring North American locations and maybe some British locations. Even though the American film industry was actually running the world in the 50s. They were more about promoting overseas and, those destinations. Whereas by the time we got into the 90s, they didn't care about destination marketing so much. They cared about, let's just have a great storyline. So I was involved in this. And what I did, and I'm not sure, yes, here it is. What I did is I spent about 3 weeks in the Auckland City Public Library with a microfiche machine. And what this does is the library would photograph every page of old newspapers, and you get this little roll of film, you plug it into the microfiche and you just search through until you found the pages you want, and then you could print out, like has happened here, you could print out a page of the newspaper. And I spent about 3 weeks going through a whole year's worth of newspaper, 1955, 1975, 1995, looking at the movie advertisements. So that was my first part of data collection, taking those advertisements, getting them. And then I spent my time analyzing the locations represented in every single movie, both in title and in visual presentation. So when you look here, you know, African adventure, although it doesn't specifically tell me which African nation is involved, it did tell me a continent. And it did give me not only the name, it didn't tell, you know, it's not only that, it was the visual representation in the advertisement that was also trying to allure the moviegoer to go and purchase a ticket for that particular movie. So with that, I spent time analyzing the movie titles. I spent time analyzing which country the movie was supposed to represent, not where it was filmed, because most of it was filmed in the United States, but to be able to see where it was supposed to be filmed and to look at the trends over those 3 particular decades. Now, this was a good project. This would be, you know, I did this after my master's, but it was for a publication that Gordon did. It was a good project because it got me involved in not only the sort of the deep archival research process, but also being able to have a better understanding of social patterns. And remember before when I said, look, what happens with society, patterns of behavior within society. This type of historical research gave me some really good insights into what was occurring and what was different. Now I'm going to hand over to Stavia to talk about the more practical, how do I go and do archival and historical and documentary research. So my approach, or what I've just talked about, is to give you some examples of how it can be used. Now we're just going to look at the different steps, the different stages involved, and so forth. So if you're still there, Savia, if I haven't put you to sleep, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Greg. Yes, so this is more like a theory. What Greg did is more of practical. He talked about how he did his research. So now let's take a look at what are the information, where do we get our sources from? So Greg has already informed most of these in his explanation of how he went ahead and did his historical research. But to dive a little bit deeper, here we have the primary sources as well as secondary sources. This is similar to any other research. However, the difference being here is we go into the past. We look at census data, we get the historical maps, we look at the oral records from the past, any visual artifacts that might be there present, maybe in libraries, or it could be in institutions, unpublished documents, even the published ones. And secondary data is from the books and from journal articles from way back, like Craig mentioned, he's gone way back even in 1940s. So you can get information from all sources, but the information could be limited. So you might be dealing with a particular section or example, if you are looking at a census data for a particular year, but if that's not recorded, or if it's not digitalized, or maybe because of some natural disaster, you have it, that data is lost. So it's difficult to get access to a certain type of data. But overall, it's almost similar to any other research, just that the sources are different. Craig, can you go ahead and help me out here with the any other information you would like to add?
Actually, I think you've covered it really well. But what I'd like to point out is, since you specifically mentioned census data, there's often a challenge. We have probably all participated in a government census at some stage in our life, probably more than we care to remember about. The problem is anything historic means it may have changed, and there has been a historic trend in census data for maybe a period of 3 or 4 censuses, all the questions to be the same, and then suddenly for a year the government statistician decides to change some of the questions, which means we might not find it easy to do a multi-temporal or multi-time period analysis of census data. On the whole, what we're also looking at is not only what Savia's shared about here, but we're looking at the use of grey literature. And this is, as we know, published things that haven't gone through peer review, niche publications that have a particular agenda or a particular political slant or a particular purpose. So when we look at grey literature, we also face a couple of challenges, and it's simply up to us to be able to analyze and decide, is this suitable for my research?
Thanks, Greg. Now we have 4 approaches that we can go ahead and use when we are dealing with historical research. So we have qualitative, the quantitative, content analysis, and even oral history. So let's talk about the first one. The qualitative analysis, the approach here is what we go ahead and read the documents or journals or newspapers or any other documents of the past. We can qualitatively go ahead with the research. And quantitative could be wherein they have statistical, like Craig mentioned just now, census data. We can take that information, utilize it in form of quantitatively analyze it, and then go ahead and go forth with that particular study. But what happens is different departments have different statistics, so that can also be utilized in a quantitative manner. Now, content analysis is anything we go ahead and read. Like, for example, if you take about, say, a newspaper article from the 1960s, if we get something like that, we can go ahead and analyze that. But if you want to compare or bring it into the modern life, we will understand that there's a lot of different aspects that we'll be needing to look into. Now, oral history is my favorite, as I was already discussing with Craig some time back. When we normally talk to our grandparents, we tend to ask about a lot of details about the history, or they tend to share a lot of history with us. So that would be oral history, where we are actually getting information orally from maybe a clan, a community, or any particular interest that you are looking into. And a recent trend where I have read maybe about 2 or 3 months ago, maybe a year back, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's about a year back, where we have human libraries, and you can walk into the library and you can actually sit and have a discussion with a human being. And that could also be oral history. Craig, would you like to add anything here?
I think, personally, I love the human library concept because it is about our opportunity to learn from others. Although I call it 4 different approaches on this, look, oral history is a qualitative technique typically, but there can be quantitative analysis if we use in vivo, for example, to look at trend words and so forth. I think the only thing I want to add is, you talked about the example of talking to your grandparents. And I talked about the example of business people that were recorded from the government. And both of them are actually oral history. So there is both formal documented oral history that happens. There is informal oral history. So like Honky with his book, Maori Mind, Maori Land, where he was sitting on a marae talking to Maori elders and hearing their stories, that's informal. When he wrote it down and he made an analysis, he transitioned it from informal to formal. Now, I'll just sort of hark back to something that's been happening in our group chat this afternoon, and I think it's kind of appropriate, number 3. There's been a bit of discussion in our the third degree WhatsApp chat about content analysis, and I will bring together in the next month or so a webinar on that, or at least some voices on that as well. It's not an area that I'm that great at, but when I look at it, what I did with the globalization of globalization of the movie industry was actually a light version of content analysis to some extent. But let's do a webinar on that into the future. I'm just going to move on to the next slide for you, Savia. Sorry, my mouse is playing up. There we go. All yours.
Okay. The characteristics of the historical research. So just like how we have questions that are unanswered, we frame our questions, we use hypotheses, we go ahead and create objectives, we collect data systematically. It's the same out here as well. The only difference is here we're taking it from the past. We have questions that could be related to the past. Yes, we have data available, but many of the documents or the archival data that is there is limited because we don't get access to them. There are several data that has already been digitalized, but yes, there's a huge chunk of which isn't. Here in India, we are still trying to digitalize our archives because when about 6 months ago, when I went to, we have a huge library where it keeps records of the archives. Now, to get a particular document from the 1940s, it took me quite some time because we did not have a digitalized document available for that particular time frame. So yes, the data can be limited. The explanation may not be in depth. It may not, it may not explain why something actually happened, or it could be explaining something which you are not really interested. It's out of the box. You wanted something, but it's not there. So that's also like a limitation. But it investigates different things. You can investigate individuals, ideas, movements, institutions, cultural circumstances. Now, when you say individual, you could take, for example, any famous personality, or you could also take an individual from an indigenous community. You could have ideas, you could investigate about ideas from different people, movements as well, like the revolt or even the feminist movement or any animal rights movements or anything, any of your choice as well. You could go ahead and investigate about those as well. Now, but this employs a scientific method. For that, I'm going to take help. Craig, go ahead with that, please.
It's really just applying the same degree of ethics and the same degree of caution to this research, to investigating, to verifying and analyzing the source of the data, to understanding the agenda of those who have contributed different things. Let's give a really good example, because I'm going to use a very odd example that doesn't use text, but I'm going to talk about maps. So in 15th century China, there is a famous map which has basically China as the center of the world. And that's actually not only comes from the Chinese name for the country itself, or for Chinese name for its historical name, as center of the world, but it's also their own belief that because they're there, everything else is around them, which makes sense. So China was this giant landmass surrounded by sea, and the rest of this world was just basically a circle of land around it. Now, that also supports the flat earth theory because it had nothing to do with us being part of a globe. Now, when I look at that, we've got to understand why was that constructed? Why was it created that way? There were technological issues in terms of course, they can't travel as far. They were working on what resources they had, etc. They were working on cultural assumptions as being the main cultural group within the world first before anybody else. Now, scientific method is really coming back to, we've got to understand what was the context of that map being created versus today's globe where we see China as a part of the world and not as all of the world. So it's really about doing your verification, understanding the agendas or the biases that the different people who constructed, whether it be maps, whether it be texts, books, etc. It's understanding all of that. And it's simply saying, look, how reliable is everything. So when we jump into any historical research, we've got to look at any document and say, is this a true representation? And the truth is always relative. So the answer is never going to be yes, but you're going to be able to see the degree in which it is. Is this a reasonable interpretation of events at the time? Is this a first-hand experience? All of those type of questions.
Yes, that brings us to the steps in our historical research. So the steps are on, it's the same as that of the normal research, but what we need to focus on here is how we go ahead and analyze data. So we have already gone ahead to find the problem. We have already framed our questions. We have also gone ahead and formulated our hypothesis. We have collected our data from primary sources, the secondary sources. Now comes the analysis part. Now, there are two aspects into here, wherein we have external criticism and internal criticism. Now, external criticism actually deals with authenticity. So was the person who's recording this, was he or she actually really present there? Was the document that you're trying to look into, was it an actual document from the period that you're looking into? Or was it, it's like passed down from generations to generation? Okay, we have internal criticism, which is dealing with accuracy. So the one who is noting down the information, was that person biased? Was that person unbiased? Was he actually telling the truth? Or was he, did he have some like a hidden agenda in his mind? Did they go ahead and tamper with the documents, change it? Triangulation is as simple as wherein you are trying to go ahead and get information from various sources, but each person has a little different way of telling it. However, they also add their own knowledge about that particular information. So what you do is you just try to go ahead and see where everyone has said the same thing, and then you bring it down to that and then make that into your study. And then you have the synthesis of data, which is again the conclusions and the findings. Craig, would you like to add something?
Sure. So I think the key point that we come, and if I can come back to where you're talking about both external and internal criticism, our job as researchers is to try and address this as best as possible. I see you have a guest there, Savia. Cool. So the thing with historical research, no matter how we're going about it, whether it's artifacts, whatever, it's always going to be inaccurate. Our job as a researcher is to dig as deep as we can and be as reliable as we possibly can with what we're doing, with the data, with the information that we've got at hand. At the end of the day, it is unlikely that we will ever find perfect data. That doesn't mean we say, I'm not using this, because if that's all we've got, we work with it and we do our best to put our lens, to put our worldview, our understanding on it. But we need to go through, at least with the internal and external, we need to go through those basic questions, and we need to be able to say, have I got it, as best as I possibly can.
Limitations of historical research. Now, generalizations may not be feasible, because if we are talking about, say, for example, a particular community, I'm taking community because I love the indigenous people. I'm sorry, Craig.
No, please, fantastic.
So we can't generalize what they do, or from where they come from, or their culture, or anything that they follow. We can't generalize bring it into our community. So it is in a way very, it falls under limitations where we can't generalize things. We cannot actually rely completely, like Craig mentioned before, on the historical documents, because at that point in time, maybe there was no research as such, like where we now, I mean, there was research, but not like the way we do it now. There could not have been objectivities that were written down. They would not have first-hand information. And information could be also incomplete. So it is, we can't, entirely rely on that kind of information. So what we need to do is we need to go in depth with that. Craig, can you take over?
Sure. Hang on. Oops, you can hear me. Okay. So anything to do with historical research is going to have limitations or problems. We've got a situation where history isn't verifiable through observation or experimentation. We can't repeat history and see whether we get the same results. We don't go and start another war just to see whether a certain event happened. We can only put our own set of interpretations on it. But that's valuable because it's still going to open up discussion. It's still going to analyze what we know about something. The bigger part is just the fact that we cannot replicate the uniqueness. So at best, as researchers, at best, we are simply guessing, but we're making an informed guess as to what has happened in a particular event. Anytime, we strike these problems, we strike these limitations, our job as a researcher is not to fully solve them. Our job is to mitigate them. Our job is to, where we can, triangulate, to ask critical questions about the validity and the position of the source of the information, and address those within our thesis. It's not about saying we've got it perfect. It's about saying, look, we've got this data. We know these problems are here, but we still believe that this is the best data available for us to draw a conclusion. And then draw your conclusion. That's really what research is about. So it's never going to be a perfect situation in any way. I'm going to move on, and I think Savi is going to be grateful that I take this slide. It's really looking at elements of historical research practice. And to be honest, I don't really want to talk about all of them because I need to really think hard about some of these. And for master's level, I'm sort of going to not worry about a few of them, but I think the key elements and some of the practices are very valid for us. And I want to focus on the 4 elements: reportage, explanation, understanding, evaluation. Reportage is us telling somebody else's data. It's us putting a story onto someone else's data. But the practice that we have to do is, look, we've got to be able to critique. And maybe, excuse me, maybe criticism is a hard word there, but it should be source critique, perhaps. We've got to critique that the data source is reliable. That's not a difficult thing to do, but it can be a frustrating thing. You know, I used hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles. We assume that the newspapers are a reliable source of information, but even in Singapore, for the longest of times, there was only one newspaper controlled by the government. So it has some biases inherent in it. So understanding that helps us, and that's where triangulation comes in. Our idea here is to be able to verify through different resources, through different sources, what happens. Explanations is, you know, our job becomes to provide an explanation for what we see. And I really don't want to cover all of those, but I do want to talk about periodization. And I know I just saw Daniel had a question about hermeneutic. I can't even say the word. I'm going to address that one later, I think. But periodization is about understanding social contexts at a period of time. You know, our childhood is different to our adulthood. What is acceptable in society, behaviors, practices, even what is acceptable today versus 10 years ago has changed. Our explanation has got to provide a context, because at the end of the day, when we're viewing it right now, when we're viewing it as we are today, let me turn the camera on. When we're viewing it as we are today, the same rules of society don't apply. So we've got to look into that. Understanding is really going deeper. And again, I don't want to touch too much on that because it's sort of a lot more advanced, but I would happily take questions separately from tonight. The practices, though, is simply being able to utilize theoretical approaches to try and develop a strong understanding of what has happened. The one thing that I want to really talk about, because I think this is valuable, is the evaluation element. And this is us, you know, really talking about what happens and putting our own perspectives onto it. And the 2 practices that are used are understanding and power. And I want to touch upon this because we are more enlightened today than we were yesterday. The researcher has a power differential to the researched, because although we weren't part of it, we're in a better position to analyze what happened as we continue. And knowing that all research is ultimately a power play between different actors, between different conflicting sources of information, is something that we do need to be able to think about and consider. In terms of that, I want to move in to the researcher, the research, and the researched. And this is really about the nature of historical cognition. And really, as a researcher, the research we are doing is on people who don't have any idea we're researching them. And that's not observational research where we sit in a park and we watch behavior of people. We are sitting in a time machine watching the behavior of people in a time that we were not part of. So not only are we disconnected to the researcher, to the researched, we are in a way disconnected to the research because of temporal connections. So there is some challenges we face. This is not immediate research. This is very arm's length and at quite a distance. So it's important to understand that, look, us as researchers, we're historical storytellers. We're not able to get feedback from those being researched to see whether we're right. We're not able to obtain corrections from this. But also the research itself is something that, again, we're at arm's length. We're intimate with the research because we're doing it, but we're also distant from it because it happened somewhere that we're not, or at a time that we're not necessarily involved with. And really what we have to be able to develop as we think through how we're doing things is having a deeper analysis to help us understand our understanding of what we accept as or believe as knowledge. And I don't want to get into the philosophical guidelines here, but let's just take an example. Today, hurting an animal will be considered animal abuse. 80 years ago, we were getting dinner doing the same thing. Knowledge has changed. Understanding of context has changed. Understanding of patterns of community behavior has changed. For example, 30 years ago, if you went on an airplane and a child was screaming, the parents would be embarrassed. Today, we see so many parents say, everybody else should shut up. Our child is allowed to scream on an airplane. And the sense of entitlement is different. And you can already tell from my choice of the word entitlement where I am. But it's about context. And it's about not only us as researchers understanding that context, but us as researchers conveying that context to those who are reading it as well. Just before we wrap up into a Q&A session, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about digital historical research. And there's a couple of elements to this. This can be honestly, this can be a whole webinar on its own at some stage, but digital historical research is about us embracing the use of digital records that help inform our research. It is about the digitization of efforts of different researchers over time, but it's also about how we're using technology to data mine historical data sets to be able to bring in for our own research. So this includes how we use AI, how we use bots, how we use trackers and everything else to help us get the data out of historical data sets from different sources. At the end of the day, it's about understanding our context, our concepts, the need for reflection. We've got to decide for ourselves how do we ensure that we are getting historical data available to everybody rather than just to a privileged few. So I, for one, am very strongly in support of libraries, universities, businesses, government departments, NGOs, making available scanned copies of everything that they have in their archives. I think that's brilliant. The Singapore National Archives, all of those microfiche and different resources for the oral history product, everything today is available online. I didn't even need to go to Singapore anymore to do it. I can sit on my laptop and I can access everything and I can get translations and everything. Couldn't get that 30 years ago. But I'm encouraging of us doing that. The problem is when we go from a physical artifact, a physical document, to a digital document, some of us might believe that we have lost something in the process. I'm going to counter that and say, actually, we've made that resource available to even more people than we had previously. And this was actually an article from Malaysia a couple of years ago, and it was actually just before the first time I taught this webinar for the third degree. And we have the Sultan of Pahang, I think, is a very well-respected historian and academic. And he was involved in supporting a project that was digitizing Malaysian historical documents and artifacts for future generations. And I think the heading says it all. It's vital to preserve our history, because no matter how unimportant something today seems, a researcher tomorrow may simply want to make use of that.